New Jersey Conservation Foundation. I'll just say that again, since the recording note came up. Emil DeVito.
Okay, Emil, you froze for me. Emil DeVito, New Jersey Conservation Foundation. Kristen.
Good morning, Kristen Maestrel, Vice President of Stewardship with New Jersey Audubon.
Thanks, Kristen. I've got, let's see, Elmer at njtreefarmer.com. You want to introduce yourself? Elmer, whoever that is, are you able to identify yourself? Doesn't look like you're muted. All right, we'll try to come back. Joe?
Joe Basralian, Chatham Township Open Space Committee.
Okay, a little hard to hear. Joe Basralian, Chatham Township Open Space Committee is what I heard, in case anybody didn't hear that. We got somebody on the phone at 973-722-4934.
Good morning, it's Elliot Ruga, New Jersey Highlands Coalition, and I'm going to have to hop off around 9:30. I don't know if I'm going to get past introductions, but we'll see how far we get.
Okay, I mean, Elliot, we can also make sure we give you a chance to ask, a question before you hop off too. Who did I miss? I got a little distracted because I was trying to deal with getting this meeting recorded. Did I miss anyone who didn't introduce themselves? Did I get everybody?
Good morning, Mara Tippett, Associate Director, Raritan Headwaters. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mara. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So let me just give really brief background here so we can jump right into it. So this is a subgroup of the ecological work group of the task force. And this subgroup arose as we started to get into a proposal related to, regulatory changes regarding forest management on public lands. I think it came from John Thonay. No, I'm sorry, it came from Christie at Raritan Headwaters. And we had other similar proposals from John Thonay and others. And as we started talking about Christie's proposal, I think we quickly realized that we didn't have a common understanding of the current, state of play, what the current legal regulatory requirements are for forest management on public lands, what the practice is, and decided to form a subgroup to really try to get that common understanding first, because we didn't want to evaluate proposals if we really didn't understand what the current state of play is and have a common understanding of that. So we did have one conversation of this group already. In the course of that conversation, I think people had different opinions or experiences with kind of what is or isn't required in terms of regulations and how DEP is applying that, and to what degree public input is required. And so we had a lot of questions. We said we need DEP to help clarify all of this for us, so that it's not just sort of, well, one person thinks it's this way, another person thinks it's that way. So we're hoping that you all can give us some clarity on a number of things, generally sort of like what regulations currently apply to timber harvesting, forest management plans, kind of the whole process for how the state forester makes determination about approving a forest management plan, which then I guess triggers some exemption from flood hazard regs in particular. How does that work? What are the things that the state forester considers? Issues about what are the requirements for public input and what's been the practice there. At that point, I think Vin brought up this 14-step process for public lands. And so everyone kind of wanted to understand that better. Where does that come from? Does that flow out of a particular statute and or regulations? Where and how is that being applied on our public lands? that's sort of a really quick thumbnail sketch of sort of, the first conversation that we had, some of the questions that arose. I'm sure if I missed some of the questions that, folks on the subgroup are going to bring them up, but hopefully that at least kind of gets everybody up to, sort of up to now. So I think what I will do is turn it over to you, John, and your team. If you guys, if there's any sort of information you want to share at the outset, and then maybe we could go, we could move to Q&A. Does that seem like a okay way to handle this?
Yeah, that's great. We had a brief discussion about this yesterday. Vince and his team are a little newer to the Forest Task Force conversations. So just kind of, set that reality at the outset. But really, I think we're hoping for more of a dialogue and a bit of a Q&A discussion here. Vince and Ryan and Patrick, I don't know if you all had some thoughts right at the outset before we dive into more of an interactive engagement.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add, thanks, John, is it's in our rules, the flood hazard rules, the wetlands rules, they apply to everyone in the state, irrespective of who they are, whether the land is owned publicly or privately. It doesn't say that explicitly in the rules, and we've had problems with FEMA as a result of this, because FEMA said, well, how do we know that your flood rules apply to, say, a state building? And so we point back to our definition of person, and it says any person that wants to do XYZ has to meet these rules, and a person can mean anything from the federal government down to, your Uncle Tony. So it's a very broad, it captures everyone. So I just wanted to toss that out there on the onset. And Pat and Ryan, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I can just give at least kind of a piggybacking on that, and at a very high level, the main rules that we're talking about here are the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, which is, regulates floodplains and riparian zones adjacent to streams, and then Freshwater Wetland Protection Act rules, which deals with freshwater wetlands and transition areas. So they're all kind of they're areas of regulation that you have a stream, you have a regulated water, you have a wetland. Doesn't matter what the underlying property is or who owns it. You're under our jurisdiction. And the way that the regulations are set out when the Freshwater Wetlands Act was first, that's and the statute itself included an exemption for silviculture activities approved by the state forester. And then when the flood hazard area rules were expanded to include riparian zones in 2007, and since we've developed a permit by rule for forestry management activities. So what that, it's slightly different than an exemption. An exemption is, you're not subject to the rules. An applicant can look at the exemption and say, I believe that we meet it, and they don't necessarily need anything from our permitting group within DEP. And then, whereas the flood hazard area permit by rules are more, you are under regulation, you are under jurisdiction, but it lays out the criteria that you have to meet. And it's very similar. It's kind of, anyone can look at it and say, I think I meet this permit by rule, and maybe I'm trying to build a fence or something. I take it to the construction official. I say, here's how I meet the permit by rule, and they, they can issue the permit. You don't necessarily need to come to the Division of Land Resource Protection for a permit for a PBR, but frequently we do have applicants come in just for confirmation, so they're kind of covering themselves. So a little bit of a different nuance between an exemption and a permit by rule. In both cases, you can apply to the department for confirmation, but you do not have to. So that's kind of just a broad overview of the regulations that are kind of in play and how silviculture is usually handled under both of those regulations. So at least that's kind of the very high overview from the permitting standpoint. And I'm sure that, John or Todd want to kind of chime in on kind of the forestry process also.
I would just add to Ryan that the permit by rule under flood hazard that covers forest management activities is permit by rule 26. And like Ryan said, most PBRs, if you meet it, you don't need to come to us for anything. 26, you still have to get a forest management plan. So it's another step, which is very unique to the permit by rules. So it's very similar to the freshwater wetland rules. And yeah, we do permits for everybody. So typically, you know, we do development permits, but we also we also do permits for different state entities as well.
It's a good point of transition, I think, probably to Utah to just kind of intro the planning piece, but I see Don has a question.
Well, why don't we, if it's okay, Don, let sort of Todd go, and then we'll turn to questions and get to you. And then Elliot, make sure if you have a question, get your hand up before you have to leave.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. So good morning. I guess first off, I apologize for the kind of crummy lighting in my office. I always feel like I'm under a cloud. But you know, I guess my name's Todd. I'm the bureau chief of the Forest Service. I was one of the thinkers, one of the brains behind the development of the 14-step process in, I don't know, 2014, 2015. So I'm just excited to have a conversation with you this morning and talk about how that process is applied, some of the ways that it came to be, and answer any questions about that. So I guess as an overview, you know, I would not say that the 14-step process is based in regulation. It's more of it was a way for us to, I call it like a way of life, right? It was a way for us to meet some of the challenges that we were seeing in developing forest management in a more of a sort of a write and review phase that we were in, and we were looking to adapt that and to bring stakeholders both internal to the DEP as well as external, from NGOs to citizens to municipalities, and have them have a pen in the planning process throughout the entirety of it, rather than a red editorial pen at the end, you know, after the prescriptions were developed. So you know, what we were trying to do is craft a framework for people to have engagement and opportunity to, you know, not just comment, but to shape that management plan. And you know, the goal at the end was for folks to have the ability to look back at that planning process and feel like they were connected to it, and that they had the ability to influence it, and that there was some management aspect to that plan that was for them and that they could relate to. So some notable examples of where that 14-step planning process was used would be whiting and double trouble. The Forest Service foresters worked through that process for those plans. And I would say, you know, that's still in effect today. While we haven't done a landscape level natural resource stewardship plan since the double trouble plan, we have been working on inventory work, forest inventory work, particularly in Wharton. And so we have a forest inventory plot for every 20 acres of Wharton State Forest. So we've been contracting that over the years. We're using that inventory data to work on stakeholder processes and design management activities that, while we haven't done the landscape level planning, we try and bring aspects of that 14-step process into everything that we do from a forest management perspective. So, you know, that's meeting with you know, our regulatory folks in DEP, that's meeting with Fish and Wildlife, that's meeting with Office of Natural Lands Management, that's meeting with a lot of you on this call to try and get some management prescriptions and or identify priorities for activities and going from there. So it's really just it's a way for us to formally organize ourselves. It is a part of our land management review process, which, you know, so that's where it's really, I guess, tied to more of a regulatory aspect. It's tied to an internal process and procedures where all folks in our programming who do forest management have the ability to look at activities that occur on state lands and to comment on them. And then the 14-step process is a way to get that further, you know, have that reach further out into the stakeholder world. So I guess I'm just happy to answer any questions about it. I would say, you know, the basis for our authority for managing forests and things like that comes from Title 13. You know, that's what gives us, that's what creates the forest management program within the department and gives us the authority to manage those resources, and some of those things are spelled out there. So the 14-step process isn't chiseled in stone, nor are all those steps, there's flexibility built into it. So it's really, I think of it sort of as a forest management planning, choose your own adventure novel. You're not going to know, there is no defined start and stop to each of those steps. There is no assigned time period. It's really one of those things where the stakeholdering dictates where, what, and how things proceed to some degree, with the forester's role being that we try and synthesize the dialogue and the conversations and trying to create and model management prescriptions. I would say the criteria for the 14-step process came from things like the Montreal process, trying to incorporate planning aspects from both the federal stewardship program as well as the Montreal process, and making sure that we're in line with the criteria and indicators there, as well as being true to our state forest action plan. So, and those are some of the guiding principles of that. We do have general outlines of planned contents and things like that. I guess, yeah.
That's great, Todd. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for the setup. So let's go to Don, and then Elliot, whom I realize cannot raise his hand because he's on the phone. So
I'll defer, since Elliot, I think, was the genesis for this by declaring that there were no rules that apply to public land. I'd rather let him start, recognizing that he has to get off in case there's anything important he has to.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you, Don. I really wish I had more time to stay, because this is really all about a dialogue, which we really haven't had yet, and a lot of the concerned people on both sides, both at DEP and stakeholders, are present right now. And I think the biggest concern we have, well, we weren't even aware of the 16-step process until it came up at the last Forest Task Force meeting, and someone had a document defining the process and how it came about, and it listed the New Jersey Highlands Coalition as one of the stakeholders who were involved in the development, and we have never heard of it before. I guess our major concern is that it seems like the department is doing its thing according to what it knows to do, and we feel there is no required public process, that the forestry program as practiced on public land, our involvement is a courtesy, and you can take or leave what the public has to say, that we really don't have a authoritative stake that has to be consulted in order to move forward. And that has become a challenge to us. So that I think basically outlines our concerns, and hopefully we can have a positive dialogue about this, and you'll understand our concerns, and we'll understand better why things are as they are today.
All right, thanks, Elliot. That's helpful sort of perspective. I don't know that there's a question in there necessarily, unless John or anyone on your team want to respond to that. We can keep going.
I guess I would just chime in a little bit on that, in that the most recent planning effort that I've been a part of that incorporated the 14-step process in its entirety was Double Trouble, and so that was approved in early 2016, January 1st, 2016. So I think that 14-step process is still in effect. It is still part of the LMR policy. And so that public stakeholdering associated with that process is still required in order to participate in that LMR program, which we are required to do.
Thanks, Todd. I'll just offer, I've got this unique perspective because I've only been in the department for a little over a year now, formerly with New Jersey Audubon, and joined New Jersey Audubon at a time when many in this Zoom room at the moment were in a very deliberate, focused discussion with Senator Smith on a piece of legislation that, among other things, would have required the department to adopt Forest Stewardship Council standards and abide by those as a planning guideline and process for moving forward with its public lands planning. That was a in about 2012. It predated that time period, but that's when I walked into the conversation. And that bill went all the way through the legislature, landed on Governor Christie's desk, and I believe he conditionally vetoed it. And then the department, maybe even simultaneously, because I wasn't in the department at that time, moved forward with this 14-step process, which as an outsider to the department at the time, I saw that as a reaction to that legislation, what Senator Smith had spun up, with input from so many organizations that are in this space and some of the individuals that are here today. And I remember sitting in rooms with Todd and Emil and Don and others working through what that 14-step process would look like. I think some of what I hear you say, Elliot, and I sense in the community as a lack of awareness of that is the fact that, frankly, I don't feel like the department's done a lot of public-facing public planning on state forest lands. Double Trouble's out there. There's been inventory work for Wharton. There have been some steps taken to develop other plans, but those haven't come to the finish line yet. One of the things we're doing internally is having discussions about advancing those planning processes and re-engaging stakeholders in those steps. But this has gone through fits and starts over the years. And I think that's just important to recognize some of the origin of where, at least as I see it at that time, some of this may have come from. So I'll stop there.
Well, let me quickly comment. Actually, I don't know if I'm toggled on mute or not, but
We can hear you, Elliot.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that, John. I mean, but that goes to show that there's sort of two different understandings of where we are and how we got where we are today. You know, I'm sure that you and your colleagues are doing what you think is the best way to go about handling our public forests. But we've had an awful difficult time even having a dialogue, a sincere dialogue about what the issues are and have them acknowledged. And, you know, our primary concern is that the standards that you are operating on for forest stewardship on public lands were essentially developed for private lands. And we see this in the Highlands because, I mean, we talked about the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, but the Highlands exemption for forestry is not a permit. It's an outright exemption from all Highlands water quality regulations. The 1,000-foot buffer for vernal ponds, the prohibition against disturbances on steep slopes, the 300-foot Highlands open water buffer. And, you know, we see forestry as not necessarily a hard development, permanent development, but it has impacts the way it's practiced today that are not acknowledged and accounted for. And I think in a nutshell, that is 95% of our concerns.
Okay. Thanks, Elliot. And I know you're going to have to sign off soon. You know, we're recording this. If you've got any other thoughts, you can drop them in the chat. And we're going to move on to some other folks at this point. Don's been patient, so we'll go back to Don here.
Oh, thanks, Tom. Well, thanks to all you people for, you know, immediately shedding some light on this, or clarity rather. One follow-up to what Elliot just said, and maybe somebody, either Ryan or Patrick, could follow up on this. When Elliot stated that there's an outright exemption in the Highlands, I believe that exemption says that all of the regulations have to be followed, meaning that the wetlands regs and the flood hazard rules, any other applicable law, still has to be followed if it applies. And could somebody address that, please? And then I have follow-up questions, so I'd like to continue with that.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, you know, they'd have to go to each, you know, whatever rule might be applicable on a particular site. So if there were wetlands, they could go to wetlands now. I mean, the exemptions kind of mimic each other in the wetlands reg and the Highlands regs and the statutes, so that they're kind of similar. And the same with flood hazard. You know, you still have to make sure that you meet the requirements that are listed in the exemption and in the PBR. But you're right, it doesn't automatically, there is overlapping jurisdiction of those different rules.
Right. Well, thanks. I think we need to make sure that's clear to the subgroup, because when Elliot says things like there's outright exemption, you don't have to follow any rules. That's kind of, I feel like, what started this conversation, and that's not completely accurate. Also underpinning this, to get down into the weeds a little bit, some of the questions about the specific exemptions we might need clarity on. For example, in the freshwater wetland regs, John Thonay had pointed out that one provision tied to a definition of an established silvicultural activity, or established and ongoing silvicultural activity beginning on June 30th, 1988 is what the exemption applies to. And if you read it the way he's describing it, it would suggest that if your farming or silvicultural activity wasn't established then and ongoing within every 5 years, the exemption doesn't apply to that land. So I'd be curious to see how you have managed that when reviewing these exemption through forestry permits. And then he layered in that, maybe is the second question that's been brought up, is a lot of the rules reference a forest management plan, but nowhere is there a definition of forest management plan. So perhaps this would shift to Todd in giving us some kind of description why that, or maybe it's with the regs people, like, why isn't there a definition of a forest management plan? Is it to provide flexibility to capture all the different kinds of plans that are possible? So maybe we could start there.
I think Randy's muted.
Yeah.
You want me to start with that?
Ryan.
Yeah, Todd, why don't you start, and then we can put it back on.
Sure. I mean, I think, there's a couple different, I think it's not particularly defined, because I think it is an evolving thing, and there are different vehicles particularly in the private lands world, where you can meet the standards of that regulation, whether it's a woodland management plan, a stewardship plan, a harvest plan, that comes into our foresters who work with pinelands and work with land use and review those plans for applicability and that exemption or that permit by rule. I would say on state lands, we have worked with stakeholders to craft the content of those plans. And I would say that quite frankly, the standards of these plans are elevated. And we've worked to incorporate, like I said, previous to this, elements of the Montreal process, federal stewardship requirements, like John said, looking at the elements required in FSC style plans. And so, we've really tried to craft a plan that meets a broad array of needs. And I think expectations for public land management are greater. I think we have a responsibility to demonstrate more of the alternative analysis and trade-off discussion, as well as some of the inventory and other work. Not that private lands plans don't hold those same standards. I think we're just under more of a microscope, as evidenced by our gathering today. And so we do have an outline of a typical natural resource stewardship plan that we put together. But I would also argue that those things can evolve over time, and as requirements, you think back 10 years, you're talking about the increased look at carbon offense, carbon defense, and some of the strategies associated with that. So, I really look to whether it's the Forest Action Plan, some of those other planning documents that give us the basis for that. So,
well, thanks, Todd. I think that makes sense from the perspective of the overall content in a forest management plan for public lands may have a higher need for information than a private land. But what I think this group is really focused on is how those exemptions for the rules apply. So are you saying that there's different standards for protecting wetlands on public lands than protecting wetlands on private lands or flood hazard areas? Because
no, I would say all the things that you look at in the private lands, you got to also think about how rules work, right, in state government. And, so rules typically govern how or describe how state government interacts with folks on the outside, or how we regulate folks on the outside. So if you look at the stewardship rules, for example, it talks about wetlands and flood hazard. Those types of things are how the private lands folks need to know how to meet those expectations when they come in for that review. So those things are spelled out very prescriptively in those rules. Rules don't govern how one part of DEP regulates another part of DEP. I need to meet the standard of the flood hazard and wetlands rule. So in effect, those requirements are mirrored for me. I feel the need sometimes to potentially go above and beyond that in certain areas that may not be related to wetlands or flood hazard, right? Maybe more intensive forest inventory data or more intensive modeling or things like that. Those are above and beyond, but the bare minimum that I need to do is to meet the standards of those regulations. And so that there is no, like Ryan and folks said this morning, there is no distinction between private lands, public lands, in terms of meeting the requirements of the laws. I think where we have the ability as stakeholders and folks who work together and have different interests is to, tweak the contents of those plans and some of the language within them.
So just building upon that, then is it fair to say that when there's inconsistencies with things like the BMP manual in terms of wording in relation to the current rules, and I'll use the example that was brought up in the past, the BMPs refer to streamside management zones, and those sizes for the SMZs aren't consistent with riparian zones in the flood hazard regs. It's been my experience that when plans are reviewed, they're reviewed to the most operative or recent standards. And I just wanted to confirm with you that that is the case, that there's not a default to the weakest of the BMPs. It's so even where there's inconsistencies, it's the highest.
We're held to the highest standard.
Yeah,
and so we're held, whatever that, if that standard has changed, if there are new rules that come out, things like that, you may, like the new C1 streams and things like that. Like we are held, as those things change, we're held to the same standard, and it's the highest standard across the board, because I'm not, I got to meet the legislation or the requirements of that.
Okay.
All right.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, that's helpful line of questioning. Thanks, Todd. I think we should, just in the interest of time, I want to make sure other people get their questions. So I'll move on to Joe Australian, please.
Guys, it seems like this is both helpful, but it's also very confusing. I think it suggests the next step. Is it possible to put together a pamphlet or booklet on how this process works and what the sources of authority are for each of the steps? I think it could be both reassuring, but it could also assist everybody in feeling like they understand it, and it could take temperatures down a little bit. For instance, it'd be nice to know in that pamphlet, not only the chapter and verse of the sources of authority you're speaking about, but also what are the opportunities, real opportunities for stakeholder input. Since the public owns all the public forests, I think the clarification of where the public input portion comes in. And I think I am a layman, I'm not a forester. It sounds like this has really been developed by specialists for specialists and has not yet gotten to the step in its evolution that this is really being explained to the public, or even to some of the groups that are listed as stakeholders and don't feel like they are. Could we consider a next step like that, laying everything out in a pamphlet or booklet that really helps clarify things?
Guys, want to respond to that suggestion?
Tom, I mean, I think it's an interesting suggestion, and I recognize there are a lot of pieces here. Maybe it's most appropriate for the task force to consider that as a proposal as a next step.
Right. Right. I think
Fair.
what Joe is pointing to is that greater clarity, transparency about exactly how this process works and what the public opportunities are, right? To have input in that would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't want to dismiss it, right? Like, we're all listening and paying attention as staff at the department and frankly, servants of the state and all of you. So I want to, and I don't mean that in a flippant, I'm honestly, sincerely saying that. So I think we have to go away and kind of process this and figure out how do we take that request and integrate it into what frankly is an overwhelming set of priorities every day that we all come to work, because there are just far too many things than there are people to accomplish all these things that we want to get done. So,
Right.
you know, whether that's more stakeholder meetings or written documents, I'm not sure, but I think it's a great suggestion for the recommendations that the task force is working on, and something for all of us to consider as state employees.
Right.
Fair enough. Thanks for suggesting that, Joe. Let's go to
And
Gene.
thanks, John. Yeah, we'll definitely give it some thought.
Hi, I think it's important that we have a conversation about definitions like logging and commercial harvesting. My understanding is that what we're calling logging, which I call commercial tree harvesting, is already prohibited on state lands. And yet I see members of groups saying, let's call for a ban on logging on our state lands. Can I have the folks at DEP clarify some of these definitions and what actually is going on when trees are removed for ecological management purposes, and how that relates to how they pay to get the work done? Thanks.
Okay, who wants to take that one?
Todd.
Take that one. I'm always looking to see who's the mute button may come off first. Yeah, so no, there is commercial logging, how you get the work done. There isn't any restriction on that on state lands. Like I referred to earlier, Title 13 provides the department's ability. It creates the state forester. It creates the department's ability to manage the lands. It sets forth some criteria and indicators there in terms of what those goals and objectives should be towards sustainability, forest health issues. There's also Title 13 also governs like the Forest Fire Service and their ability to prescribe burn and things like that. So, I think what you're getting at is sort of the distinction between management considerations, silvicultural prescriptions, locations, localities, how to get the work done. And to be honest with you, that's a big challenge for ecological forest management in New Jersey, is sort of that blending and that balance of what do we need to do, what scale do we need to do it at, what are the goals and priorities of that management, and then how the heck do we get it done, and how do we get it implemented, and how do we monitor that, and how do we come back to those areas and monitor that. So there's any number of ways, and I would say that depends on things like market conditions as well as things like the silvicultural prescription. So, a lot of the ecological forest management work that we do, particularly in the Pinelands, is dealing with density issues and really small diameter trees that it's not a commercial value. We have contracts, we're paying thousands of dollars to implement these activities on state lands because of the ecological need and opening up sunlight for rare plants and animals, and benefiting the fire risk reduction and pine beetle risk reduction of those ecosystems. So I would say that the majority of the work that we do is not commercial harvesting. There isn't a product being removed from the site, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be. And that also doesn't mean that it's tremendously lucrative, right? Sometimes you may be looking to, for instance, break even in an activity in terms of the costs. And I would say the economics of any forest management decision aren't the driving factor. I think they are at some point, figuring out how you're going to get the work done is a factor in terms of whether or not that activity moves forward, right? If you're looking at a density management project in the Pinelands region that may take a significant portion of money to implement, you have to identify that funding source. You have to identify that operability, and sometimes that's in-house. Sometimes that's, I know Emil has been out to Magnolia Road in the Pinelands region where we're doing an oak regeneration project. We tried to bid that project out several times. We got nobody who wanted to pay us for it. We tried to bid it out for $0. We got nobody who wanted to do it for $0. And so we're slowly doing that in-house. We're working on that project in-house. We're planting the trees. We're out there on hot days, using chainsaws and cutting down the density projects to allow for that oak regeneration. So, there's a broad array of how different projects get implemented. And I would just say the vast majority of them are not where money is coming back into the state. But to answer your root question, it can, right? It could. And that's just the economic factor in terms of the management. But, there isn't the idea that I have to include so many large trees in order to make this operable or something like that. I think I'm looking at a stakeholder-driven process where we're trying to do ecological forest management. New Jersey isn't a state. I'm not Oregon. I'm not Washington. I'm not in the business of growing trees bigger, taller, and straighter and harvesting them and then starting all over again, right? My bread and butter in terms of forest management in New Jersey is ecological forest management and capturing. You got 9 million people in this state, and you got a heck of a lot of it is forested, and a heck of a lot of it is publicly owned. And so I work for all of you, and I work for everybody in this state. And so I got to try and find balanced management approaches and take advantage of some of the gems that we have as a state from an ecological perspective. And that also means I need to speak up when I see things or forest conditions that are not in line with perpetuating that. And so things like density management, things like mesification of oak forest and things like that, those are things where we need to work with the system, in my perspective, and that's a stakeholder process. I look at density management in the pinelands. I think there's a heck of a lot of areas where that's an appropriate management tool. I think the where, the what, and the how of that is through a stakeholder process, working with partners like Forest Fire Service to strategically locate density management projects, to look at areas that are most at risk from southern pine beetle, things that really could be significant sources of atmospheric carbon if those systems were to have those damage causing agents unleashed in them. So it's about working in places that are meaningful and having stakeholders, internal and external to the DEP, help shape those decisions.
Great, thank you, Todd. That's very helpful. Let's keep moving. Time's running away here from us. So Emil, go ahead.
So first, I just want to say that I pretty much agree with everything that the DEP folks have been saying. I've seen lots of tremendous projects, both in and out of the pinelands, but especially in the pine barrens. Now you even have me saying pineland. So anyway, so my comments are more toward the areas that are not protected by flood hazard, by riparian, by wetlands. There are tens of thousands of acres of upland forest on public land that are not in the pinelands, they're not in the highlands. And take Stoke State Forest, for instance. I believe that right now, if we had a governor or a commissioner of the DEP that decided that we needed to sell our forests for biomass to make money, that you could go into unregulated uplands and do whatever you want, and you wouldn't even have to write a plan. I mean, you guys would write a plan. You guys would probably object to doing that. But I believe that there are no regulations whatsoever right now to stop the state of New Jersey from converting forest to non-forest on parklands that are not in certain regulated areas. And with what's going on in the world, God only knows what could happen. I'm thinking worst case scenario, right? We could have somebody who wants to convert our forest to grassland to game bird habitat and just make gigantic clear swaths on top of Kittatinny Ridge. And I don't believe there's a regulation that would stop it. We could have someone who wants to convert our forests to biomass and turn them into southern plantations in certain areas, say Salem County, right? We could go to the areas in Salem County that are state land, and or any place outside the Pinelands CMP jurisdiction where you have huge swaths of upland forests on state land around the town of Millville or other places, and convert them to non-forest or convert them to biomass plantations of non-native species. And I don't believe there's a regulation that would stop it. So I understand that you're trying to utilize a 14-step process. I thought the project at Double Trouble was fantastic, and the others in the Pinelands. We've made a lot of progress, in with stakeholdering and hearing people's views. But I still believe that there are literally tens of thousands of acres of state land that, if we had the wrong people in power, could be, no requirements for any kind of rare plant or animal inventories, anything like that. They could just be completely converted to something, completely different. And I want to hear somebody say that that's not true, but I believe it is true. And it needs to be acknowledged, and we need to do something about it.
I guess I would say that it's not true based off of what I read in Title 13 and what are, the creation of the forest management program and what the framework and the lanes of what our management authorities relate to in that, and that you're talking about sustainability. I would also point out, things conversion to non-forest, you're looking at, certain, there's no net loss legislation, there's things like that that would make that unfeasible. But, in particular, Title 13 and the Forest Action Plan, things like that, those are guiding documents, those are regulatory that would restrict us from, my perspective of that would be that would be acting negligently and the mistreatment of the state's public resources, particularly to not involve the public in that type of, what you're describing as a large scale change in tactic.
So I think if we need to get to the bottom of that, if that's actually true, right, that we couldn't have policy changes that put us on a completely different path, then that would, if we can get to the bottom of that, that would go a long way toward satisfying a lot of people's concerns, right? Because I'm just wondering, I'm talking about unregulated uplands with no vernal ponds, with no streams, with no riparian areas, no wetland buffers. I'm talking about all those areas that are not covered by any kind of a BMP or regulation, right? We really need to get to the bottom of that. I'm not
right.
We need to delve into
right?
Title 13. We need to delve into Title 13, right? And understand what is, what is dictated by that as to what is permissible and what is not permissible. And I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that any of the fine people at the DEP would be going down those roads in the near future. But we all know what could happen, right? How societal objectives can change, and people that gain power can put us on very different paths. And it would be great if we have people in power right now that think that those things would be wrong, that we somehow get them ironclad so that they can't happen without actual legislative and regulatory change. And that we need to get to the bottom of that.
Okay. Well, maybe we could, I'm going to follow on step. If you guys have like Title 13, readily at your fingertips, if that's a document that can be shared with the subgroup, so people can kind of better understand that statute. It sounds like it's a key statute because, Todd, the point about the state forest action plan, obviously, a new administration can have a new forest action plan. So that may be guiding on binding all of you now, but that's a piece that can easily be changed. The Title 13, obviously is in statute. So it does seem like that's something we need to better understand. Let's go to Sylvia.
That would be very helpful. I haven't heard Title 13 come into the discussion before, so that's very helpful. I've only heard reference to flood hazard and wetlands and that sort of thing, and BMPs and, exemptions. I never heard anybody talk about Title 13 before, so that's really important that was brought up today.
So I'm just going to pipe in a little, just for a few seconds here. So Title 13 is the statute that created basically, state parks, Forest Service, natural lands management. So that's the enabling legislation that dictates, how we are to operate. And then your regulation is always tied to the statute. So just wanted to make sure everybody understood that.
Yeah, so if you look at the top of the rules, it'll define the regulatory authority where that comes from. It refers back to Title 13.
Right. Thank you. Okay, Sylvia.
Yes. I have a couple questions. The first one is, where would we find in the New Jersey rules forestry activities on public lands? That's my first question. And if somebody from the DEP can answer that, that would.
You would find forestry activities on public lands in Title 13 and the creation of the Forest Management Program, and then the roles and responsibilities of that program, the roles and responsibilities of the state forester. There are things in there that amend, so like the Urban and Community Forestry Assistance Act amended Title 13 to create the Urban and Community Forestry Program. So you'll see in Title 13, there's different things, not just for public lands, there's also aspects of like the Urban and Community Forestry Program, the Forest Health Program is defined in there. So that's where you would see the public lands. Rules, like I said earlier, rules typically guide how the department or how state government interacts with non-state government or regulates non-state government. So you'll see rules for nursery sales, seedling sales, things like that. So how we as a state nursery will interact with the public and what the requirements are to buy seedlings, what the requirements are to how to utilize those seedlings. Rules govern our interaction with the stewardship program and with the criteria of a stewardship plan versus a woodland management plan. Some of the farmland tax assessment, those rules are Treasury's rules, but they have forestry components to them. So again, rules are more outside of state government, or that nexus between them, whereas Title 13 is what creates some of those authorities for operations on public lands.
Okay, and I'm sorry if I'm asking a basic question, but I'm sort of new to some of this aspect of this. Would the Title 13 be found in the New Jersey 7:3, or are we talking, I see somebody just put it in the chat, so it's completely different.
It's completely different. So those are the rules. So those are those rules I was talking about that govern that outside interaction. 13 is if you look at the top of the rule, the 7.3, it'll reference the Title 13 as sort of the authority that gave us the ability to craft those rules.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then
you can find the specific forest, for the various rules, you can find specific forestry Title 13 information at the top of those rules.
Okay, and then what about in the Highlands, because the Highlands Act specifically discusses, has recommendations for buffers and, where I'm under the understanding, and I guess this is something we need to clear up, that the Highlands Act, the exemption for forestry was really done to help private landowners, and that it should not be applied to public lands. And so where in the rules does it apply in the Highlands? Because I know the Pinelands has its own act and its own rules, but the Highlands is a little wonky. So could you help explain that?
So in the Highlands, we meet the standards of flood hazard and wetlands. So we are exempt from the Highlands rules. And in Pinelands takes over some of those regulatory aspects of the flood hazard. And so there are increased buffers and things like that. In Pinelands, a 300-foot buffer in Pinelands. But again, you're allowed to operate in those transition areas and in those riparian areas. So, you know, provided that you meet the standards of having the plan and that you meet the criteria set forth in those other things. So, you know, despite there being a 300-foot buffer, say in Pinelands, right, there's an increased buffer that, you know, I look at that more as for non-forest management activities where you're maybe removing stumps, you're doing a land use change, something along those lines. We're operating within those areas for things like cedar restoration and things like that. So provided that we're meeting those standards and we're following best management practices and consulting with those groups like Pinelands, we're you know, allowed to work in those areas.
Okay, and so that brings me to another sub question on this. So for example, the Highlands Act recommends that for vernal ponds, vernal pool systems, you should have 1,000-foot buffers. And because a lot of the Highlands it's also, you know, very severe steep slope area. And the current forestry, you know, the FSPs that have been written don't follow those rules. Instead, they use a lower buffer of 400. And so if we're thinking about how public lands should be managed, I think many of us on this call believe that our public lands should be held to the highest standard. In fact, you even mentioned that, which I love. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. And so if in the Highlands and in the Highlands Act, it says 1,000-foot buffers, why aren't we doing that today? Like, I would like to see this group, since we're talking about regulations, you know, that should be something that should be consistent. And so I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Maybe I can answer this. So
Sure. You go ahead, Ryan.
I think the difference here is that, you know, the Highland statute that kind of created the authority to create the subsequent rules, that provided that exemption for forestry. So once your activity is exempt from those regulations, then none of the standards that came out of that and worked their way into the rules apply. So if in order for, I guess, a 1,000-foot vernal, you know, pond, something like that to apply, the activity itself would have to be regulated under those rules. But forestry is not, it's just a completely exempt rule. So they don't need to meet any of the standards that are in the Highlands Act or its rules.
Okay,
but we
so
do need to still meet standards. So we do still need to meet the standards of flood hazard and wetlands, and then I also need to meet the standards that endangered you know, that Fish and Wildlife provides to us for endangered species, ONLM provides to us for rare plants, things like that. So there's different buffers associated with those at the recommendation of those organizations.
I think there's been an interpretation, because where in the Highlands Act does it actually say that applies to public lands? I mean, I tried to, you know, I've done some research and if you can point to me, you know, where in the Highlands Act where that forestry exemption applies for public lands, I mean, I would like to see that. So
it applies to the entire Highlands area, the preservation area.
applies to. Okay, if you wouldn't mind maybe somehow following up with the chairs, like, can you direct me where it actually says that in the Highlands Act?
The Highlands Act defines the preservation area. It's line by line, block by block, and it tells you what the preservation area is, and then that the rules govern within that area. Doesn't make a distinction between we only govern private land in that area. You know, it governs the whole area, which covers both public and private.
Okay, I wish Elliot were on, because I know that was something that was a sort of a question and of, you know, is that being interpreted? You know, it was our understanding, I guess, that at some point when that forestry exemption was put in the Highlands Act, it was because of private landowners to alleviate some of the stress that they've had. And so how it somehow applied to everything, I think, is, as we're looking at creating stronger regulations for our public lands, I think this is something that we should hopefully be able to address. And then my third question I have is for Green Acres lands, where are the rules that allow for silviculture activities and who issues those permits? And are permits even needed?
Yeah, I'm looking for another non-mute. So I guess it depends on, and Robin, I may call on you for some assistance here. It may depend on how those lands are assigned and what those, what different restrictions are with those lands. So if Green Acres purchases land outright and it's assigned to state parks and forests, then it would roll into Title 13 if there are no additional deed restrictions or other things associated with that land. So there are various types of state lands, and some parcels have different requirements that may change how that land can be managed or utilized, but typically there's not a distinction. If it's incorporated into the state land system, there's not a distinction as to where that land came from, how it was, so to speak, purchased for the subsequent management. We would be able to manage that land under our Title 13 authority and go from there. I would say there are some easements, deed restrictions, things like that, where Green Acres helps, say, counties or local municipalities purchase land, or helps facilitate some of that process that may spell out different, over the years, there's been different variations of different deed language that may reference, must be under a stewardship plan, may reference, different uses or requirements for that land. So that may vary parcel by parcel, but I would say on the large part, I am not involved in the management of those lands. They are usually assigned to a different entity, and the Green Acres lands that I am, they're state lands now, right? Green Acres was the vehicle to get them into the state land system. They're assigned to Parks and Forestry for now, our new organization, or Fish and Wildlife, and so they have that designation with them.
So go ahead.
I just want to tease that out a little bit.
There not my area of expertise.
No, and you did a great job, Todd. There are times where we may receive Green Acres may receive land and water conservation funds. That's part of an acquisition of a property, state acquisition. So there may be some federal added restrictions on some lands that we administer, that we acquire. And again, we're just talking about the state lands acquisition program, not county or local.
Sure. You can look at, federal programs like the Forest Legacy Program, Robin, you reminded me of that. So that's a U.S. Forest Service provides funding to Green Acres to purchase forested land. And there is a management requirement. That doesn't mean active management, but there needs to be a planning element to the oversight of those lands.
And the only other thing is, I don't know if Dave Golden wants to add any additional clarity for Fish and Wildlife.
Sure. Yeah, I'll add that we purchase properties that are managed as wildlife management areas in basically three ways. Some are acquisitions through Green Acres, Sylvia, like you're pointing at. Some are acquired through revenues from hunting and fishing licenses, and others are acquired through federal money. Our authority to manage those properties, forestry and other types of work, also exists within Title 13.
Okay, great.
Okay, and then
So, Sylvia,
yeah.
I do want to make sure we can hear from other people, because you have asked 3 questions and we've got about 20 minutes left. Is it okay if we?
Yeah, I can email everybody.
And put them in the chat too. If you have other questions, put them in the chat. But just to be fair, I want to make sure we can hear from other people with their hands up. Thank you so much. So let's go to Kristen.
Okay, thanks. Can you all hear me? Because I've been having, having issues with Zoom and connections. So the first is probably more of a statement / comment that I just want to kind of reiterate and probably get confirmation from DEP folks that not only is there Title 13, there's the wetlands regulations, there's the flood hazard area regulations, and the land management review process. There is also, an added endangered non-game species regulations that then put in additional timing restrictions, and depending on the species that may or may not be, that may be present at a site, it also adds, a level of percent canopy cover that can be removed at one time, and how quickly things can move along. So just another added layer of kind of the regulatory and checks and balances that are required for a lot of this work. And then I wanted to clarify my understanding too with the flood hazard area regulations is that it not only includes the riparian buffers, but it does also include drainage areas. Is that correct? Right. So if an activity is occurring in a certain drainage area, so it doesn't have to necessarily be directly next to a riparian zone, but if it is part of a larger drainage area, those flood hazard area regulations are applied.
Yeah, we look at the entire flood hazard area, so the riparian zone, floodplains, all of that, and then we regulate under flood hazard. We regulate any stream that drains more than 50 acres.
Right.
Or
So
any natural stream and anything that drains more than 50 acres.
Okay. Yeah. So, so kind of going back to Emil's comment about, recognizing that there are likely upland forest areas that, that don't have regulations, but, there is that drainage area as well. So it's not necessarily the 300-foot buffer. You're also looking at that, any streams that are, anything that's occurring within 50 acres or more of that drainage is regulated.
I guess we should probably clarify. So it's not necessary. So when we look at drainage area, we're saying, all right, how much water is coming down, how many acres drain down here to determine if that particular water course is regulated and has a floodplain. So really any natural water course has a riparian zone. So you have that. And then if it drains over 50 acres, you also have a floodplain. And, and in some case, it depends on how big the river is or the stream. Sometimes that floodplain is contained within the riparian zone. Sometimes it extends well beyond it, especially in, some of our northern rivers and in the tidal areas. But when we're talking about actual specific regulations that I think have to do with forestry, it's going to be predominantly riparian zone standards under the flood hazard rules.
Great.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. And then unless anyone has anything else with that, my final question is in participating in these discussions, right, there's been a lot of concern over the safeguards that are in place and in case some of these rules or regulations are not followed. And so it'd be great to hear kind of what that process looks like for safeguards, just so folks can hear what that process looks like.
Well, I guess from our standpoint, if somebody were to not follow the protocols that or the requirements of the exemptions and the permit by rules, then they are open to enforcement action from DEP. We have an enforcement group that could either make them try to obtain a permit or have them restore the area, and there's fines that could go along with that. And so there is, at least if they do violate the standards there, and generally those things are, in this particular case, these are probably large scale violations that they would get acted on by our enforcement group.
And I would just add to that, particularly in private land situations, the Forest Service works hand in hand on those enforcement actions from a forest management perspective. So, talking about permit by rule 26, not only do you have the elevated requirement of having some type of planning mechanism to get you that permit by rule, the Forest Service on private lands also, reviews and approves those along with Pinelands in the Pinelands region. And we inspect those plans. So we're on those properties, and oftentimes we're the ones that are working with the enforcement folks saying, like, this, if this wasn't followed or if this was followed. Typically those situations are not related to private lands forest management. they are folks who don't have plans or who are just clearing a portion of trees to put up a barn or something like that. So a neighbor will call us and say, hey, does this property have a plan? And we say no, and then we work with enforcement, go down that road. So, and I just to your list of things that sort of govern forestry from a regulatory perspective, I wouldn't want to leave out pinelands as well. So oftentimes there are other aspects of conforming with the CMP there that are involved as well.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Let's go to Christy, please.
Hi, and thank you so much for all the folks from DEP who've been able to join us today to answer these questions. It's been very informative. So just for a little context, we had submitted, Mara Tippett and I from Raritan Headwaters submitted a proposal to try to elevate the standards for buffers on streams and wetlands on public forest lands in New Jersey. And that's what kind of led to the discussion that we don't really know what the current standards are. We had some folks thinking that they were really strict already and others saying, no, they're not. So I'm just kind of getting back to basics because we want to kind of get to that. And I like, again, Sylvia mentioned this, but Todd, you're saying we want to hold our public forest lands to the highest standards of protection. So what are the buffer widths for wetlands and streams? I mean, are they should also be based on surface water quality standards, I'm assuming, and the category of the streams. And what is the buffer? Because it sounds like, I mean, a buffer is supposed to protect the integrity of the stream and wetland from impacts adjacent, of land use and other activities. So what is the definition of the buffer? If you're allowed to bring heavy equipment in and disturb soil for forestry practices, are there, what are the regulations on that? What are the actual standards? It seems like it's too loose to even put a finger on it of what we are doing in our current buffer. So let's say we have a 50-foot buffer or a 150-foot buffer or a 300-foot buffer. What does that mean? Because it sounds like it's still being disturbed. And I guess related to that is the question of, you're trying to do a really good job of protecting these watershed resources, but how are you able to actually check and enforce this? This is kind of, Kristen asked this question too, but does that actually happen on a regular basis? It just seems like there's not a lot of people to go out and check on things to make sure they're done the right way, especially if the regulations are kind of loose. So I don't know if I've asked the question in too many, convoluted way here, but I'm still wondering what the buffers are and what's allowed to happen in those buffers.
All right, so I'll answer that question and then maybe pass it off to Todd for maybe some of that follow-up and how that works. So the under flood hazard, you're correct. It is based on surface water quality standards. So the buffers for riparian zones can be either 50 feet, 150 feet, or 300 feet. So if you're category 1 water or an upstream trib in the same up 14, then it's 300 feet riparian zone. 150 is more for threatened and endangered species habitat and maybe some trout waters. And then if you don't have either of those, then you're 50 feet. With wetlands, it's either 50 feet or 150 feet in pretty much all circumstances. And 150 feet is, again, threatened and endangered species habitat or trout waters. So what that does is that gives you our area of jurisdiction, but the rules are set up in a way that you can encroach within those areas for certain types of activities. That's when you come to our office and get a permit. You have to meet certain standards. Now, in this case, it's exempt for the most part, or it's a PBR. And I think what the rules require the user to follow as far as practices is the BMP manual. So maybe I can let Todd kind of jump in at that point.
So I guess I just wanted to highlight, sort of some of that distinction is that it's not exempt from activities in those areas. We can operate, we can, the rules, the wetlands and flood hazard rules prescribe what type of silvicultural activities can occur in those transition areas or those buffers. They also, it's not like an exemption to just go in there and operate. It's a permit by rule, meaning that if you meet these standards, the risk for harm to those areas is low, and that it's an acceptable activity within those areas, provided that those standards are met. So it's not just a blanket exemption. There still is criteria and indicator, criteria that we have to meet in order to operate in there. And it's not every type of forest management activity that operates in there. So there's different BMPs and different things like that you must adhere to. But like I said earlier, you can operate in those given that you're meeting those standards for minimized risk to those areas. And in terms of your question about enforcement, again, I know this group's primarily focused on state land. So, we're on site of any activity, or we're the ones implementing those activities. We work hand in hand with the enforcement arm. There's an entire enforcement group that enforces these rules across the state. So on private lands, we inspect the property. So if a stewardship plan is good for 10 years, we try to get out there several times, and as well as there's a certification process annually for the private lands folks where they need to state what work they've done and certify that. So
quick question. So the BMP manual from 1995 is the one that's used, that if we want to look at what's allowed in the buffers, what kind of operations that you're mentioning, where would we find that?
I would look to that mirrored approach to the rules. So the flood hazard and wetlands protection rules would govern what's, again, looking at what's required for PBR 26. And that's where we would come into that. And so those standards, whether it's public or private land, are mirrored. So those are the criteria we have to meet.
So based on our past meetings, and John Thonay, who's not here today, did a review, it looks like the flood hazard area rules and the wetland rules require that there's a forest management plan approved by the state forester, and that anything related to riparian streamside areas or habitats needs to follow that 1995 BMP manual.
Correct.
And so apparently, I have to be honest with you, I have to review it myself. There's been so much paperwork going back and forth, but is that considered adequate? Because many people in this group have been saying that needs to be updated and made more, I think there needs to be more detail about what actually is allowed and not allowed, and maybe even, are we talking about going right up to the stream, with heavy equipment and removing trees, that kind of thing? I don't even think that's stated. So it's hard for us to know where to start when we don't even know what's allowed at this point now.
So there's a couple BMPs, right? There's the Atlantic White Cedar Restoration BMPs. There's the BMPs that you referenced from 1995. I mean, you think about how Atlantic White Cedar Restoration is conducted with corduroy roads and things like that throughout the restoration activity. So, I guess I would say the majority of, and there's not a ton of work that occurs in those areas, but there are certain things that does. And I believe, Ryan, and I think there's restrictions on clear cutting and things like that. There is some other descriptive language within your rules and your regulations that we're required to also meet.
Yeah, there is, and Ron beat me to the punch and post and kind of provided a link to where the PBR language is. So one of the first standard is that that it's conducted in accordance with the BMPs and in accordance with the forest management plan. But then there's also, BCD3 other sections of rules that talk about other various requirements, including you can't remove tree stumps and no clear cutting unless it's unavoidably necessary as part of the silviculture prescription. So there is a little bit more beyond just meeting the BMP and the forestry management plan.
And you obviously have to still address that silvicultural need and prescription in the plan approved by the state forester. So, it's not, there is other things for general property maintenance, for instance, or, it's not cutting trees down to view a river better. It's not those types of things. It's a silvicultural application where you're perpetuating forest on the landscape. It's not a land use conversion. It's not for aesthetics. It's not for that type of other types of tree cutting that I would not call forest management, so to speak.
Okay. So we have about 3 minutes left. I do want to give Vin a chance to ask his question. He's been waiting patiently. That probably is going to be our last question, but I would suggest that a couple people have their hands up who asked questions before. It's fine to have additional questions. I would say if we've got other questions we didn't cover today, if you send them to me, I can share them with John and his team, and to the extent you are willing to answer any additional questions that we might have as a follow-on, we'd really appreciate it. So let's go to Vin.
Thank you. So the initial proposal was to more broadly eliminate forestry from 1,000-foot riparian zones, possibly including the wetlands as well. Subsequently, it was proposed that a letter of interpretation should be included in order for people to work in those areas. I was just wondering if you could speak to, systemic problems of violations within riparian zones on public lands, or from your perspective, is there a need for that?
We don't have anyone from enforcement on the call to speak, I guess, anecdotally about it. I mean, at least from where we sit in permitting, generally a major violation results in permit application to us to try and rectify it. We have not seen, I mean, Pat, jump in if I'm wrong here, but I'm not aware of any large scale riparian zone or wetland violations on public land that ended up coming to us. You aware of anything, Pat?
No, I can't think of anything that that we've done.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, Pat at least he's been covering the northern part of the state for the better part of 20 years, and I've kind of covered the southern part of the state for 20 plus years too. So, if it was something large scale, I feel like we would have heard about it. But again, we don't have an enforcement entity on the call to kind of speak to that.
This is Robin again. I think it might be important to just spell out that doesn't mean that something like that hasn't happened on state lands. It's just that it wasn't driven by us. We have encroachments everywhere. And, people near our property boundaries may do something illegal that we are completely unaware of. So just want to put that placeholder out there.
To clarify, that's like on the peripheral of forest management plans and, activities as such. I guess a quick follow-up question is, there's a review paper that outlines all the BMPs for 49 of the 50 states. And it gives a breakdown on the riparian widths, and they go up to 300. In the forest action plan, it says that you guys participate on some sort of like regional group to help develop those BMPs. Is that part of the process, or can you speak to the adequacy of those widths?
I guess, I would leave the adequacy of those widths to the folks that enforce and interpret and apply those rules on this call. And so again, I am meeting the standards that are set forth for everybody in the state. And if those change based off of different rulemaking, or like I said, the different designations in surface water quality and things like that, we adjust accordingly. I would say, as the Forest Service representative, we participate with our neighboring states, both informally, formally. In the Region 9 of the U.S. Forest Service, we meet regularly. We meet nationally with all states. So, some of that idea is to get, share information and get standards addressed. What may work in New Jersey may not work in other states, but you look at things like fire risk and southern pine beetle and how that is now, we work closely with states like Maryland and Delaware and now New York that have southern pine beetle infestations, and working together on sharing information and technology there. So I would say the Forest Action Plan is our guiding light in terms of a planning document, and that is a planning vehicle that is across all states in the nation. So should be able to look to that 14-step process. Things like that are strategies for carbon offense and carbon defense and ecological forestry are all laid out in that plan. As well as, there is a section on interpretation of these rules that we're talking about and things like that. So, there is sections of the Forest Action Plan there. So,
okay. So I think we need to wrap this up. I really want to
could we get in the chat the reference to the document that Vin just mentioned about the reviews of the BMPs? I can't remember exactly what he called it, but he said there was a.
Yeah, or Vin, maybe you can share that with the subgroup by email. I think that would be helpful. So, but I do want to wrap it up. I want to be respectful of the fact that we've had so many folks from DEP spend a good 90 minutes with us. We really appreciate your time and kind of information sharing, good, thoughtful conversation. I want to thank everybody on the subgroup. I think this is really helpful just to have this, real constructive dialogue and information sharing. I think it's going to serve everyone really well. And obviously the conversation is, to be continued, but this is going to really, I think, help this subgroup, wrap our heads around kind of the current situation and better evaluate proposals, and hope that DEP will continue to stay as involved as you can, because your participation certainly, makes this a much better process. So thanks everyone, and to be continued.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.